Volume 1, Book 3, Chapters 16 through 23 of The Life of Apollonius of Tyana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F.C. Conybeare. Volume 1, Book 3. Chapter 16. When Apollonius approached, the rest of the sages welcomed him and shook hands, but Iarchus sat down on a high stool, and this was of black copper and chased with golden figures, while the seats of the others were of copper, but plain and not so high, for they sat lower down than Iarchus. And when he saw Apollonius, Iarchus greeted him in the Greek tongue and asked for the Indian's letter. And as Apollonius showed astonishment at his gift of prescience, he took pains to add that a single letter was missing in the epistle, namely a delta, which had escaped the writer, and this was found to be the case. Then having read the epistle, he said, "What do you think of us, O Apollonius?" "Why," said the latter, "how can you ask, when it is sufficiently shown by the fact that I have taken a jamie to see you, which was never till now accomplished by any of the inhabitants of my country?" "And what do you think we know more than yourself?" "I," replied the other, "consider that your lore is profounder and much more divine than our own. And if I add nothing to my present stock of knowledge while I am with you, I shall at least have learned that I have nothing more to learn." Thereupon the Indian replied and said, "Other people ask those who arrive among them who they are that come, and why. But the first display we make of our wisdom consists in showing that we are not ignorant who it is that comes. And you may test this point to begin with." And to suit his word, he forthwith recounted the whole story of Apollonius's family, both on his father's and his mother's side, and he related all his life in Aegea, and how Damis had joined them, and any conversations that they had had on the road, and anything they had found out through the conversation of others with them. All this, just as if he had shared their voyage with them, the Indian recounted straight off, quite clearly without pausing for breath. And when Apollonius was astounded and asked him how he came to know it all, he replied, "And you too are come to share in this wisdom, but you are not yet an adept." "Will you teach me then," said the other, "all this wisdom?" "Aye, and gladly. For that is a wiser course than grudging and hiding matters of interest. And moreover, O Apollonius, I perceive that you are well endowed with memory, a goddess whom we love more than any other of the divine beings." "Well," said the other, "you have certainly discerned by your penetration my exact disposition." "We," said the other, "O Apollonius, can see all spiritual traits, for we trace and detect them by 1,000 signs. But as it is nearly midday, and we must get ready our offerings for the gods, let us now employ ourselves with that, and afterwards let us converse as much as you like, but you must take part in all our religious rites." "By Zeus," said Apollonius, "I should be wronging the Caucasus and the Indus, both of which I have crossed in order to reach you, if I did not feast myself on your rites to the full." "Do so," said the other, "and let us depart." Chapter 17. Accordingly they betook themselves to a spring of water, which Damis, who saw it subsequently, says resembles that of Dirce in Boeotia. And first they stripped, and then they anointed their heads with an amber-like drug, which imparted such a warmth to these Indians that their bodies steamed, and the sweat ran off them as profusely as if they were washing themselves with fire. Next they threw themselves into the water, and having so taken their bath, they betook themselves to the temple with wreaths upon their heads and full of sacred songs. And they stood round in the form of a chorus, and having chosen Iarchus as conductor, they struck the earth, uplifting their rods, and the earth arched itself like a billow of the sea, and raised them up 2 cubits high into the air. But they sang a song resembling the paean of Sophocles, which they sing at Athens in honour of Asclepius. But when they had alighted upon the ground, Iarchus called the stripling who carried the anchor and said, "Do you look after the companions of Apollonius." And he went off swifter than the quickest of the birds, and coming back again said, "I have looked after them." Having fulfilled then the most of their religious rites, they sat down to rest upon their seats. But Iarchus said to the stripling, "Bring out the throne of Phraortes for the wise Apollonius, that he may sit upon it and converse with us." Chapter 18. And when he had taken his seat, he said, "Ask whatever you like, for you find yourselves among people who know everything." Apollonius then asked him whether they knew themselves also, thinking that he, like the Greeks, would regard self-knowledge as a difficult matter. But the other, contrary to Apollonius's expectations, corrected him and said, "We know everything, just because we begin by knowing ourselves. For no one of us would be admitted to this philosophy unless he first knew himself." And Apollonius remembered what he had heard Phraortes say, and how he who would become a philosopher must examine himself before he undertakes the task. And he therefore acquiesced in this answer, for he was convinced of its truth in his own case also. He accordingly asked a fresh question, namely, who they considered themselves to be, and the other answered, "We consider ourselves to be gods." Apollonius asked afresh, "Why?" "Because," said the other, "we are good men." This reply struck Apollonius as so instinct with trained good sense that he subsequently mentioned it to Domitian in his defence of himself. Chapter 19. He therefore resumed his questions and said, "And what view do you take of the soul?" "That," replied the other, "which Pythagoras imparted to you, and which we imparted to the Egyptians." "Would you then say," said Apollonius, "that as Pythagoras declared himself to be Euphorbus, so you yourself, before you entered your present body, were one of the Trojans or Achaeans or someone else?" And the Indian replied, "Those Achaean sailors were the ruin of Troy, and your talking so much about it is the ruin of you Greeks. For you imagine that the campaigners against Troy were the only heroes that ever were, and you forget other heroes, both more numerous and more divine, whom your own country, and that of the Egyptians, and that of the Indians have produced. Since then you have asked me about my earlier incarnation, tell me whom you regard as the most remarkable of the assailants or defenders of Troy." "I," replied Apollonius, "regard Achilles, the son of Peleus, and Thetis as such, for he and no other is celebrated by Homer as excelling all the Achaeans in personal beauty and size, and he knows of mighty deeds of his. And he also rates very highly such men as Ajax and Nereus, who were only second to him in beauty and courage, and are celebrated as such in his poems. With him, said the other, O Apollonius, I would have you compare my own ancestor, or rather my ancestral body, for that was the light in which Pythagoras regarded Euphorbus. Chapter 20. There was then, he said, a time when the Ethiopians, an Indian race, dwelt in this country, and when Ethiopia as yet was not, but Egypt stretched its borders beyond Meroe and the cataracts, and on the one side included in itself the fountains of the Nile, and on the other was only bounded by the mouths of the river. Well, at that time of which I speak, the Ethiopians lived here, and were subject to King Ganges, and the land was sufficient for their sustenance, and the gods watched over them. But when they slew this king, neither did the rest of the Indians regard them as pure, nor did the land permit them to remain upon it, for it spoiled the seed which they sowed in it before it came into ear, and inflicted miscarriages on their women, and it gave a miserable feed to their flocks. And wherever they tried to found a city, it would give way, sink down under their feet. Nay, more, the ghost of Ganges drove them forward on their path, a haunting terror to their multitude, and it did not quit them until they atoned to earth, by sacrificing the murderers who shed the king's blood with their hands. Now this Ganges, it seems, was 10 cubits high, and in personal beauty excelled any man the world had yet seen, and he was the son of the river Ganges. And when his own father inundated India, he himself turned the flood into the Red Sea, and effected a reconciliation between his father and the land, with the result that the latter brought forth fruits in abundance for him when living, and also avenged him after death. And since Homer brings Achilles to Troy in Helen's behalf, and relates how he took 12 cities by sea and 11 on land, and how he was carried away by wrath because he had been robbed of a woman by the king, on which occasion, my own opinion, he showed himself merciless and cruel, let us contrast the Indian in similar circumstances. He, on the contrary, set himself to found 60 cities, which are the most considerable of those hereabouts. And I would like to know who would regard the destruction of cities as a better title to fame than the rebuilding of them. And he also repulsed the Scythians, who once invaded this land across the Caucasus. Surely it is better to prove yourself a good man by liberating your country than to bring slavery upon a city, and that too on behalf of a woman who probably was never really carried off against her will. And he had formed an alliance with the king of the country, over which Phraortes now rules, although that other had violated every law and principle of morality by carrying off his wife. He yet did not break his oath, and so stable, he said, was his pledged word, that, in spite of the injury he had suffered, he would not do anything to harm the other. Chapter 21. And I could enumerate many more merits of this great man, if I did not shrink from pronouncing a panegyric upon myself. For I may tell you I am the person in question, as I clearly proved when I was 4 years old. For this Ganges, on one occasion, fixed 7 swords made of adamant in the earth, to prevent any monster approaching our country. Now the gods ordered us to sacrifice if we came where he had implanted these weapons, though without indicating the spot where he had fixed them. I was a mere child, and yet I led the interpreters of their will to a trench, and told them to dig there, for it was there, I said, that they had been laid. Chapter 22. and you must not be surprised at my transformation from one Indian to another. For here is one," and he pointed to a stripling of about 20 years of age, "who in natural aptitude for philosophy excels everyone, and he enjoys good health, as you see, and is furnished with an excellent constitution. Moreover, he can endure fire and all sorts of cutting and wounding, yet in spite of all these advantages he detests philosophy." "What, then," said Apollonius, "O Iarchus, is the matter with the youth? For it is a terrible thing you tell me, if one so well adapted by nature to the pursuit refuses to embrace philosophy, and has no love for learning, and that although he lives with you." "He does not live with us," replied the other, "but he has been caught like a lion against his will, and confined here, but he looks askance at us when we try to domesticate him and caress him. The truth is, this stripling was once Palamedes of Troy, and he found his bitterest enemies in Odysseus and Homer, for the one laid an ambush against him of people by whom he was stoned to death, while the other denied him any place in his epic. And because neither the wisdom with which he was endowed was of any use to him, nor did he meet with any praise from Homer, to whom, nevertheless, many people of no great importance owe their renown, and because he was outwitted by Odysseus in spite of his innocence, he has conceived an aversion to philosophy, and deplores his ill luck. And he is Palamedes, for indeed he can write without having learned his letters." Chapter 23. While they were thus conversing, a messenger approached Iarchus and said, "The king will come early in the afternoon to consult you about his own business." And Iarchus replied, "Let him come, for he too will go away all the better for making acquaintance of a man from Hellas." And after this he went on with his former discourse. He accordingly asked Apollonius the question, "Will you tell us," he said, "about your earlier incarnation, and who you were before the present life?" And he replied, "Since it was an ignoble episode, I do not remember much of it." Iarchus therefore took him up and said, "Then you think it ignoble to have been the pilot of an Egyptian vessel? For I perceive that this is what you were." "What you say," said Apollonius, "is true, Iarchus, for that is really what I was. But I consider this profession not only inglorious, but also detestable, as though as of much value to humanity as that of a prince or the leader of an army, nevertheless it bears an evil repute by the reason of those who follow the sea. At any rate, the most noble of the deeds which I performed no one at the time saw fit to praise." "Well, and what would you claim for yourself in the way of noble achievement? Is it your having doubled the capes of Malea and Sunium by checking your ship when it was drifting out of its course, and your having discerned so accurately the quarters from which the winds would blow both fore and aft? Or you getting your boat past the reefs in the hollows of Euboea, where any number of ships' ornamental signs show sticking up?" Chapter 24. But Apollonius replied, "Since you tempt me to talk about pilotage, I would have you hear what I consider to have been my soundest exploit at that time. Pirates at one time infested the Phoenician Sea, and were hanging about the cities to pick up information about the cargoes which different people had. The agents of the pirates spied out accordingly a rich cargo which I had on board my ship, and having taken me aside in conversation, asked me what was my share in the freight, and I told them that it was 1,000 drachmas, for there were 4 people in command of the ship. And they say, 'Have you a house?' 'A wretched hut,' I replied, 'on the island of Pharos, where once upon a time Proteus used to live.' 'Would you like then,' they went on, to acquire a landed estate instead of the sea, and a decent house instead of your hut, and 10 times as much for the cargo as you are going to get now, and to get rid of 1,000 misfortunes which beset pilots owing to the roughness of the sea? I replied that I would gladly do so, but that I did not aspire to become a pirate just at a time when I had made myself more expert than I ever had been, and had won crowns for my skill in my profession. However, they persevered, and promised to give me a purse of 10,000 drachmas if I would be their man and do what they wanted. Accordingly, I egged them on to talk by promising not to fail them, but to assist them in every way. Then they admitted that they were agents of the pirates, and besought me not to deprive them of a chance of capturing the ship, and instead of sailing away to the city whenever I weighed anchor thence, they arranged that I should cast anchor under the promontory, under the lee of which the pirate ships were riding, and they were willing to swear that they would not only not kill myself, but spare the life of any for whom I interceded. I, for my part, did not consider it safe to reprehend them, for I was afraid that if they were driven to despair, they would attack my ship on the high seas, and then we would all be lost somewhere at sea. Accordingly, I promised to assist their enterprise, but I insisted upon their taking oath to keep their promise truly. They accordingly made oath, for our interview took place in a temple, and then I said, "You betake yourselves to the ships of the pirates at once, for we will sail away by night." And they found me all the more plausible from the way I bargained about the money, for I stipulated that it must all be paid me in current cash, though not before they had captured the ship. They therefore went off, but I put straight out to sea after doubling the promontory. "This, then," said Iarchus, "O Apollonius, you consider the behaviour of a just man?" "Why, yes," said Apollonius, "and of a humane one too. For I consider it was a rare combination of virtues for one who was a mere sailor to refuse to sacrifice men's lives, or to betray the interests of merchants, so rising superior to all bribes of money." Chapter 25. Thereupon the Indian smiled and said, "You seem to think that mere abstention from injustice constitutes justice, and I am of opinion that all Greeks do the same. For as I once learned from the Egyptians that come thither, governors from Rome are in the habit of visiting your country, brandishing their axes naked over your heads, before you know they have bad men to rule or not. But you acknowledge them to be just if they merely do not sell justice. And I have heard that the slave merchants yonder do exactly the same. For when they come to you with convoys of carrion slaves, and are anxious to recommend their characters to you, they make it a great merit of the slaves that they do not steal. In the same way do you recommend on such grounds the rulers who sway your knowledge, and after decorating them with such praises as you lavish upon slaves, you send them away, objects, as you imagine, of universal admiration. Nay more, your cleverest poets will not give you leave to be just and good, even if you want to. For here was Minos, a man who exceeded all men in cruelty, and who enslaved with his navies the inhabitants of continent and islands alike, and yet they honour him by placing in his hand a sceptre of justice, and give him a throne in Hades to be umpire of spirits, while at the same time they deny food and drink to Tantalus, merely because he was a good man and inclined to share with his friends the immortality bestowed upon them by the gods. And some of them hang stones over him, and rain insults of a terrible kind upon this divine and good man. And I would much rather that they had represented him as swimming in a lake of nectar, for he regaled men with that drink humanely and ungrudgingly. And as he spoke, He pointed out a statue which stood upon his left hand, on which was inscribed the name Tantalus. Now this statue was 4 cubits high, and represented a man of 50 years who was clad in the fashion of Argolis, though he differed in his cloak, that being like a Thessian's, and he held a cup sufficient at least for 1 thirsty man, and drank your health therefrom, and in the goblet was a liquor, an unmixed draught, which frothed and foamed, though without bubbling over the edge of the cup. Now I will presently explain what they consider this cup to be, and for what reason they drink from it. In any case, however, we must suppose that Tantalus was assailed by the poets for not giving rein to his tongue, but because he shared the nectar with mankind. But we must not suppose that he was really the victim of the gods' dislike. For, had he been hateful to them, he would never have been judged by the Indians to be a good man, for they are most religious people, and never transgress any divine command. Chapter 26. While they were still discussing this topic, a hubbub down below in the village struck their ears, for it seems the king had arrived equipped in the height of Median fashion and full of pomp. Iarchus then, not too well pleased, remarked, "If it were Phraortes who was halting here, you would find a dead silence prevailing everywhere as if you were attending a mystery." From this remark Apollonius realized that the king in question was not only inferior to Phraortes in a few details, but in the whole of philosophy; and as he saw that the sages did not bestir themselves to make any preparations, or provide for the king's wants, though he was come at midday, he said, "Where is the king going to stay?" "Here," they replied, "for we shall discuss by night the objects for which he is come, since that is the best time for taking counsel." "And will a table be laid for him when he comes?" said Apollonius. "Why, of course," they answered, "a rich table too, furnished with everything which this place provides." "Then," said he, "you live richly?" "We," they answered, "live in a slender manner, for although we might eat as much as we like, we are contented with little. But the king requires a great deal, for that is his pleasure. But he will not eat any living creature, for it is wrong to do here, but only dried fruits and roots, and the seasonable produce of the Indian land at this time of year, and whatever else the New Year's seasons will provide." Chapter 27. "But see," said he, "here he is." And just then the king advanced together with his brother and his son, ablaze with gold and jewels. And Apollonius was about to rise and retire, when Iarchus checked him from leaving his throne, and explained to him that it was not their custom for him to do so. Damas himself says that he was not present on this occasion, because on that day he was staying in the village, but he heard from Apollonius what happened and wrote it in his book. He says that when they had sat down, the king extended his hand as if in prayer to the sages, and they nodded their assent as if they were conceding his request, and he was transported with joy at the promise, just as if he had come to the oracle of a god. But the brother of the king and his son, who was a very pretty boy, were not more considered than if they had been the slaves of the others, that were mere retainers. After that, the Indian rose from his place, and in a formal speech bade the king take food, and he accepted the invitation, and that most cordially. Thereupon 4 tripods stepped forth like those of the Pythian temple, but of their own accord, like those which advanced in Homer's poem, and upon them were cupbearers of black brass, resembling the figures of Ganymede and of Pelops among the Greeks. And the earth strewed beneath them grass softer than any mattress, and the dried fruits and bread and vegetables and the dessert of the season all came in, served in order, and set before them more agreeably than if cooks and waiters had provided it. Now 2 of the tripods flowed with wine, but the other two supplied, the one of them a jet of warm water, and the other of cold. Now the precious stones imported from India are employed in Greece for necklaces and rings, because they are so small; but among the Indians they are turned into decanters and wine coolers, because they are so large, and into goblets of such size that from a single one of them 4 persons can slake their thirst at midsummer. But the cupbearers of bronze drew a mixture, he says, of wine and water made in due proportions, and they pushed cups round just as they do in drinking bouts. The sages, however, reclined as we do in a common banquet, not that any special honour was paid to the king, although great importance should be attached to him among Greeks and Romans, but he took the first place that he chanced to reach. End of Volume 1, Book 3, Chapters 16 through 27.